Well, God obviously is beyond us, and that means it's difficult to talk about God. The only way we can really talk about God is to use language that connects to our real-world experience. So one of the things that happens in talking about God is that we use something called analogic symbolism. All of our words are symbols. They're not the things themselves. If I say the word cat, the word cat isn't the same thing as the cat itself, but what it does is it represents the cat. Now, words like cat are pretty easy for us because we have real-world experience with cats, and so when I say the word cat, that calls to mind this thing that you've had some experience with. The problem with talking about God or any sort of divine or spiritual reality is that we don't see and touch that reality, and so we don't have the same kind of everyday world experience with spiritual things as we do with the physical things, which means that our words have to take on another level of abstraction, and that's where we begin to talk about this thing called analogic symbolism or analogical symbolism. And the idea there is that we use words that describe things in the spiritual world with reference to things in the physical world. That is to say, we describe spiritual things by reference to things that we're familiar with, and we say the spiritual reality isn't exactly like that, but it's kind of like that. There's a point of similarity, there's an analogy. So, for instance, we use the word spirit to talk about God. We say God is a spirit, or angels are spirits. Well, but what exactly is a spirit? The Hebrew and the Greek words for spirit are ruach and pneuma, respectively. Ruach is the Hebrew, pneuma is the Greek. And both of those words are actually the same words that you use for breath or wind. And what they mean when they talk about a spirit using terms like breath or wind is that a spirit is a little bit like wind in that you don't see wind, but you see the effects of wind. In the same way we don't see spirits because they're non-physical creatures, and so we don't see spirits, but we often see the effects of them in terms of the way they affect us, or in some cases the way they affect the physical world. So we have to use language about God or about any spiritual reality that is sort of this one step removed from reality. So when we use words to talk about God, how important are the words that we use? And the answer is pretty important, because they do connect to our physical reality, and they draw analogies between the world that we're familiar with and the world that we're not so familiar with. So if our words no longer draw analogies, or if they draw inappropriate analogies, it begins to affect the way that we think about those spiritual realities. So, for instance, in the Adjustment Bureau, they begin to use words like the chairman to talk about God. Well, is God like a chairman? Well, I suppose in some ways, if you want to say that he's the top level of authority, like you get in a corporation, that's all well and good. However, as soon as you begin to use language like that to talk about God, you begin to put God in sort of this corporate mentality, this corporate context. And a chairman is not quite the same thing as, of course, the divine being or the great I am. God himself called himself the great I am, which is a pretty powerful statement because it sort of obliterates most human categories and creates this view of God that says he's above and beyond everything that I can begin to imagine. You call God the chairman, on the other hand, and I can sort of think about a chairman, but at the same time I can also question a chairman because he's not necessarily all-powerful, he's not everywhere, he's not necessarily all-knowing, and he could make all kinds of mistakes. And so when we begin to use language like chairman to talk about God, it does subtly alter the way that we begin to picture the divine nature. It changes the way we begin to think about who God is. And so I think to some extent the kind of change in language is significant. No words are perfect to describe God, but some words are better than others, and I would argue that chairman is not a very good word to describe God.